2 years ago I was on the Neil Larson radio show, and he tried to get me to admit that I wasn't conservative enough. And I asked Mr. Larson, are we the Republican Party or are we the Conservative Party? And we went back and forth on that, because I'm part of the Republican Party and it is full of conservatives. But it's not the conservative party, because the Republican Party is also full of moderates. And that's what makes it so amazing and awesome, is that it's the Big Tent Party, like President Reagan said. And it includes everybody who wants to be a part of it, who wants to be part of traditional American values, which is what I stand for. I never looked at a scorecard. I don't care what my freedom score is. In fact, I'm prepared to put it on a t-shirt and say, not a puppet, because I'm here to serve you. I'm not here to serve an agenda of a state or of an agency or an entity that is getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from out-of-state donors who have specific purposes for that. So as a conservative, I believe in family values, I believe in the light hand of government, and I believe that we should let people have agency to live their lives as they see fit.
All right. So I guess my question would be, my opponent did not like the idea that he wasn't conservative enough because there are lots of moderates in the party, but he's campaigning as a conservative. All of the literature says conservative, the billboards say conservative, and yet there's this interest in defending the right of moderates to be in the party, which sounds to me like he identifies as a moderate and not a conservative. So I think my biggest issue right there is let's decide. Either we really want to be conservative and let's stick with that idea, or let's say, no, we need moderates, and I'm a proud moderate in the Republican Party, and it needs to have a bigger tent. Let's talk about the Big Tent for just a second. This was a concept that Ronald Reagan championed, but Reagan's idea was not that we have Big Tent values, as in conservative values and moderate values and room for all kinds of different values. Reagan's idea was that we have a set of principles that we honor, that we stick to, and when it comes to making decisions about how we champion those specific principles or who champions those principles, we still honor our common principles enough to not attack each other in a way that weakens our ability to be effective in the long term. That's not what I see happening here. What I see happening here is one camp of Republicans that are attacking another camp of Republicans as too conservative and wanting to push them out one side of the tent while they move the stakes over and put down new stakes. It's not Big Tent Republicanism where we get along with each other in order to defend the conservative values of the Republican Party. This is Big Tent, as in give me the covers and you get out of the bed. So I think that doesn't quite hold true in terms of the analogy. The other thing that I think is worth thinking about here is the argument about scorecards. So there are a lot of different scorecards from different perspectives. Some of them are state run, some of them are national organizations that have scorecards. Some of them are special interest groups that have a scorecard looking at how legislators vote on their one issue. So it is important to recognize that every scorecard comes from a certain perspective. And when you look at the score, you should have that perspective in mind. So if Planned Parenthood has a scorecard and you don't share their values, you might not give a lot of weight to that scorecard. But there are scorecards that really focus on conservative values, which is what my opponent claims to be a champion for. And some of these scorecards are state, and maybe there's a chance that a state level scorecard might sometimes have some personality politics involved, and maybe they might be biased on one issue or another because of the personalities involved. I'll give anybody that. But when you look at national scorecards, these scorecards are run by people that don't know the people in Idaho from anywhere. These are political science majors that really are committed to a certain core set of values, and they're reading legislation in states all over the country, and they are doing analysis as to whether that legislation supports principles or doesn't. And then they're looking at the record and they're saying, these bills supported our principles, and this is how the legislator voted, and it's a mathematical equation. So I think those scorecards probably carry a little more weight than something that is local. But here's the thing. When you go to a doctor, he might tell you something, and maybe you believe him and maybe you don't. If you don't, or if you have questions, you're smart to get a second opinion. And if you get a second opinion, and a third opinion, and a fourth opinion, and they all tell you the same thing, and you look at them and you say, your opinions are garbage, I am an independent person and I will do whatever I want, you're welcome to do that. But it might not go so well for you. Because at some point you just can't always be your own expert and be smarter than every other political science major in the country. So I do think that scorecards have their place. The last thing I would say is that most scorecards are not even available until after the legislative session. And so the idea that somehow scorecards control a person's vote doesn't really hold weight in those situations. The only way it could control a vote is if the scores were being announced in advance. But I haven't ever pointed to scorecards that operate that way myself. What I have seen, though, is that the national scorecards tell a very stark story about my record compared to my opponents. And there's only one conservative in the race.
So this last session, I was one of those that fought pretty hard against JPAC for what I consider to be prioritizations that didn't line up with what I agree with. As a financial planner, I sit with clients. We talk about budgets. We always discuss that the state should budget like we budget in our homes. So how do we do that? We look at the revenue coming in. We look at the expenses we have. We allocate the money we have, and at the end of the month, we hope we have something left over. And usually, part of that budgeting process is setting some money aside for emergencies. We've been doing that in the state of Idaho for years, to the tune of $1.3 billion. That's how much we have in our reserve and stabilization funds. Then we left $230 million in what we call the bottom line. So imagine again, you're budgeting in your home. You go through and you say, we're going to leave a little bit left over at the end of the month, and we have thousands of dollars in savings. While at the same time, you have a cluster of emergencies. The water heater breaks, the roof needs fixed, the transmission just blew. All these one-time issues that you couldn't control that need money now. That's what we were faced with. And instead of dipping into those funds to be able to cover those expenses, we cut very valuable programs. And I did not agree with it. And it's not how I would have done things. So I think we should have used our stabilizer funds, our budget stabilization funds, because that's what they're for, is to stabilize our budget. And we didn't do that. And instead, a lot of people are getting hurt. A lot.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about finances. One of the things that I've been really excited to see is the way that the state has adjusted our budget process to actually mirror what most people do with their household budget more closely. One of the things that they have done is that they begin by setting aside the mandatory expenses. We identify those, we fund them, we put them off to the side, and then the committee now has more bandwidth to focus on what are called discretionary expenses. Discretionary expenses are things that you plan to pay for. They're important, like groceries and gas, but we've called them discretionary because we get to decide how much we want to spend on them. And maybe we have steak every night, and maybe we have hot dogs, and maybe we ride our bike or hitch a ride with a neighbor, or maybe we go on a long road trip, but we get to choose. So those discretionary expenses get considered next. One of the fundamental principles that the state of Idaho has been true to in our budgeting process is that our ongoing expenses have to match our revenue. And so the example that was given here talked about a family that maybe has a bunch of one-time emergencies. But the programs that were getting cut are not one-time programs. These are ongoing expenses. And so if you are a legislator that's responsible to manage these taxpayer funds, and you can see that revenues may not cover these ongoing expenses, and you dip into those emergency funds in order to cover ongoing expenses, you may find yourself a couple of years down the road still dipping into the emergency fund unless you have some reason to believe that the economy is going to recover, and your emergency fund just gets lower and lower over time. So the key here is that these were not one-time expenditures. These were ongoing, and the legislature made the decision, I believe correctly, to ensure that our ongoing expenses match our revenue. The other thing that I think is important to say here is that we have significantly increased our spending per capita over time. I know the Democrats in Boise were passing out a chart that just showed the general fund increase in spending over time. General fund monies are only 1 out of 4 pots of monies that the state's responsible to manage. And so while it may be true that general fund spending has not increased significantly if you adjust it for population growth and inflation, if you look at the big picture, you actually find that per capita spending, when it's adjusted, went up 14% over the last 15 years. So it's easy to cherry pick one category of spending and make a case that really isn't accurate when you look at the big picture. The unfortunate thing is that the chart the Democrats cherry picked came out of an LSO report that actually had charts for all 4 categories. So all of the information was there and readily available, but only part of it got shared. Yeah, one other thing that I think is important to consider when we talk about these programs that got cut in 2026 is that Medicaid expansion accounts for a huge portion of Idaho's budget. And we had the opportunity to put sideboards on Medicaid expansion. When I say a huge part of our budget, I'm talking about 92,000 able-bodied adults with no dependents that are costing the state $1,200 per month each. Now, it's true, we do get federal funds to cover part of that, but that's an enormous sum of money, and it adds up over time, even the state's portion. So we had the opportunity to add some work requirements and put some other sideboards on Medicaid expansion in 2025. My opponent voted no on that. His vote wasn't the deciding vote in terms of the bill's ultimate fate. The bill did not get a hearing in Senate Health and Welfare, and so it didn't make it through the legislature in 2025. Then in 2026, it did finally make it through the legislature when everything was so tight. But when I think about the programs that were cut, a great example that I think was a sad loss would be managed care for children on Medicaid. That was a program that served a huge pool of children. About a third of Idaho children are actually on Medicaid. But it costs only about $18 per kid per year to have managed care where a primary care doctor is overseeing where they get referred to, and it's estimated the total program costs us about $7 million, and it's estimated to save $400 million. So the legislature ended up cutting that program. That's one that might have been good to not cut, but if we had put sideboard on Medicaid expansion in 2025, we probably would not have had the cuts to ACT and to other things during the interim between 25 and 26. And we just needed to take responsibility for what was happening earlier on and prioritize our ability to help the vulnerable over the able-bodied, because sometimes we do need to make those tough choices.